can see us and hear us now.
I think they would like us to begin. So I think we should begin, and then we'll roll with it until anyone tells us otherwise. How about that, Jen?
Sounds great.
Okay, so welcome, Jen. Jen Lampton. Famous for many things, but I think most famously for really driving the Backdrop project. So thank you for that, because it's a really important thing for a lot of people now, which is kind of cool. So whereabouts are you? You're over in California somewhere, yeah?
Yeah, I'm in Oakland, California today.
All right, wonderful. Well, as you can see, I apologize for the extreme helmet hair, but I've just ridden over to a friend is racing at a place called Cadwell Park in the UK here. So I'm kind of borrowed her bike as a backdrop for this. So
That's great.
I hope she doesn't mind. So, yeah, as I say, you and still are a driving force in the Backdrop project. And that being, as Dries explained earlier, a fork of Drupal, which is kind of an unusual thing in many ways. So can you tell us about that? What drove you to begin Backdrop in the first place?
Yeah, so I think a lot of you probably know my history in the Drupal community, but I had been a member of the usability team, and that came specifically from being a Drupal trainer and watching people who are new to Drupal struggle with figuring out how to use it. Through my training, I also spent a lot of time teaching people the development side of things, and I watched people struggle a lot with learning the Drupal 7 theme layer, and I got really involved in how to improve that in Drupal 8, and I was one of the leaders for the Twig initiative for a while to try and switch the theme engine in Drupal core, and all of the things I was fighting for was to make Drupal more accessible to more people, easier onboarding, simpler for administrators, just to sort of increase the size of the people who felt comfortable using Drupal, whether that was in administration or theming or development for modules or what have you. And through the beginning part of the Drupal 8 site, I was very focused on the front end, working on Twig, trying to simplify things and consolidate things and get the kind of features people wanted in templates made available to them. And I wasn't really looking at what was going on in the back end. Just sort of like I'm focused on what I'm doing. I'm going to just leave that to everyone else.
Yeah.
And at some point, I'm not a front end developer. I mean, I do it, but I'm like, I may be the best at it. Just I'm the jack of all trades, right? Not the best at it, but I understood it and I was able to teach it. And so when I went back to the module space, which is where I usually was, and took a look at what it would take for me to like port some of the modules that I was maintaining to Drupal 8, it scared me a little bit because I felt like everything that I was working on, trying to make Drupal easier and faster and simpler and less complicated, was the opposite of what I was fighting for. And for sure, Drupal 8 wasn't done yet. There were a lot of changes that were happening, but it was getting more complicated, harder, more concepts, more typing, right? We didn't have quite the same boilerplates we have now. And it just seemed like a lot more work to get the same amount of stuff done. And so I started having concerns, I think around the time of DrupalCon Colorado, where I was looking at the way that things were shaping up in Drupal 8 and thinking this isn't the future that I'd envisioned. Like I was looking for like a simpler, easier future, and this is a more complicated, harder future. And so we had been throwing around like, well, yeah, if it goes too crazy, we could just fork it. It's no problem. But I don't think anyone was serious about forking it at that point. It was just sort of, this is open source. People say that. Yeah. And it wasn't until a couple months later where Nate, my now husband, was working on getting the CK editor, rich text editor, into Drupal core. And he had a pull request, or I guess it was a patch in Drupal land, ready, that was marked ready to be committed. And while he spent time working on that, the fundamentals of Drupal under the hood with Symfony, everything else changed. And all of the patterns that you used to introduce modules had completely changed. And so even though he had a pull request that was marked ready to be committed, the entire thing needed to be rewritten the Drupal 8 way. And he took a look at the work that somebody else magically came into the issue queue and took his patch and reformatted it the way it needed to be and put it back up. And he took a look at what he'd done and what was necessary. And it hit him the amount of work that was going to be necessary for people who are upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8.
Yeah.
And he, from that moment, reflected on what it was like for him as a business owner who provided a service, which is a website. He was one of the maintainers for the web form module for a really long time. He had a website called webform.com, which provided web form as a service. And it hit him like, what, for my business, in order to move my website from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, I have to do all of this work. And he had a bunch of custom modules. He had a bunch of contrib modules. He had a bunch of stuff that he was maintaining. And he's like, I'm just going to have to rewrite everything. And from a business perspective, my business doesn't get anything from making that move. And so for him, it was like a business idea of like, what sort of effect is this going to have on the community? And for me, I was thinking about what sort of effect is this going to have on my clients. I'm a developer of web services for people who have websites. And I had a handful of clients that I'd been maintaining sites since Drupal 5. They'd sort of struggled through the upgrade to 6, struggled even more through the upgrade to 7. And now I'm going to have to go back to these people and tell them they've got to invest more maybe than they had paid for their site to date in the process to just get it to the next version, not including any of the new features that might be on their wish list. And that to me, it felt like too hard of a sell. In addition, we're also looking at sort of a changing landscape of Drupal, right? Everybody was talking about Drupal is going to be enterprise. And I was one of those people who was like, yay, Drupal is going to be enterprise. It's going to be great. But without thinking about other changes that would trigger, not necessarily intentionally. Sometimes things change.
In terms of the types of people who would be most looked after, you mean?
Yeah, well, in terms of like priorities for Drupal, right? Things like Composer, right? It became a priority pretty early on because there's a lot of external libraries getting bundled, starting from Symfony, but then a whole bunch of other stuff now too. And having a package manager to deal with that is really helpful. But Composer is a roadblock to a lot of people too. Like there was a huge part of the Drupal community who didn't use command line tools at all. And by making that like a requirement, you're sort of cutting off the whole part of the community who wasn't there yet at that point. And so for me, it was like, okay, I'm looking at what my clients are doing. I'm also looking at like what's happening to our contributor base too, because we have a lot of fantastic developers in the Drupal community. We have a lot of people who consider themselves not developers, and trying to get an on-ramp from the not developers to developer contributors gets a little harder if you put more roadblocks in the way there. And so I was thinking about sort of the long-term implications of what these technical changes we're making are going to have on the shape of the community. I wasn't thinking about it from my own personal business. Nate was, but the two of us together talked about it and we're like, oh yeah, I think maybe it's time to investigate something else. And Nate ran off into GitHub and created a forked project and started working on it as sort of an experiment just to see like what a fork would look like. And as he started working on it, he started getting invested and he really liked it. And then people found out about it, but he wasn't like ready really to announce it yet. He was still just a pet project.
It's off in the way.
You can't just fork Drupal, right? So that's something that's gonna just slide under the mat. So yeah, people noticed, and then we had to stop and say, okay, hold on a minute. We need to announce this, and we need to think about why are we doing this, and what are we gonna stand for as a forked project? And so we started off with, well, let's go back to what our principles are. Like people are gonna say, well, what's gonna be the difference between Drupal and Backdrop? And so we went and we wrote down our list of principles. And at the time, Drupal had a page that was, I don't know, maybe 10 years out of date, but it was really hard to figure out what like the contrast was, because there wasn't a comparable page. And what we were seeing as active core developers is that what was on that page was not actively being reflected in what the project was doing because it's 10 years old. And so that was the kind of thing where we're like, well, we believe in what was on the page, but didn't believe what was happening in core development was necessarily what was best for the community anymore, and felt that disconnect. And so when we started with Backdrop, we're like, well, we're going to write down our principles and our philosophy and what we stand for, and then we're going to build a leadership structure that is here to enforce the philosophy. So if we have to make a change to a philosophy, that's fine. They can do that. But that has to come first before we make any changes to the code that don't align with the philosophy. And that way, anyone getting into Backdrop would know what we stand for and where we're going before they get involved. And, there were a lot of people in the Drupal community who felt like we thought we knew what we were fighting for. And then it turns out it wasn't really in line with our own visions for the future. And so that's sort of my story.
That's kind of gets us to where we are. Yeah. So taking that, so you go and do this thing as you're doing it and starting to talk to people, and you're saying, hey, there's this thing we're going to call Backdrop, and we've got these principles we're going to work by, and this is what makes it special. What were your expectations or worries about reaction in terms of, I don't know, someone asked a question around, were you worried about the backlash from the Drupal community?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, it all happened so fast. There wasn't really any concern for backlash. It was just like, we haven't even told them why we're doing this yet. But after it became public knowledge, it was sort of expected. Like people, Nate and I are these people, right? Put our time, our heart, our soul into the Drupal project. Like we invested so much of ourselves into this thing. And when you say, I don't like that for whatever reason, it hurts, right? Like it hurts me, it hurts him. And we understand that, without the way to properly phrase the scenario and what you're hoping to get out of it, people are going to look at that and go, oh, that's not good. Right. And so we tried to document everything as much as we could in terms of trying to explain that, like, we love Drupal. Like, that's why we put our heart and souls into it. It has accomplished a lot for all of us personally, professionally, financially, just in terms of friendships, right? In terms of the kinds of bonds you make through the community, the types of people you run into through collaboration. There's just so much great things about being part of this open source community. And forking the project is not necessarily saying any of those things are bad or wrong. It's just like, maybe we needed another option, that there's going to be fantastic enterprise software out there. Drupal is fantastic enterprise software. I use it for a handful of my client projects too. It's great. But I have a bunch of other people that no longer can really fit into that Drupal niche, and they need a future for their systems too. And so Backdrop is sort of like, it's another thing. It's the same thing. It has the same feature set, maybe not exactly, but pretty similar. Both CMSs, they both have, things like views and fields that other CMSs haven't quite got right yet. I feel like Drupal really has. There's different audiences, right? And I think that Drupal 7 was something you could say was for everyone, but there was definitely starting to be pressures on different ends of the audience, even in Drupal 7, whereas some people were like, oh, I need like really expensive Drupal specific hosting, and like I have to hire Drupal specific developers. It's no longer just PHP people. And there's different skill sets that come along with, like, if you're a front end developer, do you know Drupal though? Because that's different than just being a front end HTML, CSS framework person. And so I think sort of figuring out that those audiences might need different tools was something that hit Nate and I in that process. So yeah, for sure, there are people who are going to be Drupal loyal, who are going to have pushback against us, and we expect that when you love something, that's going to happen.
Yeah, people have strong feelings about lots of things. Yeah, that's cool. So I think it's quite clear from the things that you've talked about recently that whilst Backdrop forked from Drupal at Drupal 7, this isn't something that is static, sort of like, this is just going to be Drupal 7 forever. So tell me, where do you see Backdrop as a CMS in 5 years?
Yeah, so that is a really significant difference. People who are looking for like their Drupal 7 sites to live on indefinitely need to understand that moving to Backdrop does come with a system that's going to be continuing to get new features and updates and improvements. We're not just leaving. It's not static. It's not long-term support. It's not a specific flavor of Drupal 7. It is really something different. We do new feature releases every 4 months. So Backdrop came out in 2015, and we've had on-time releases 3 times a year since 2015. Every one of those new feature releases has new features in it. So it's Drupal 7 plus we're probably like 75 something contrib modules have been bundled into Backdrop core. And we have an ongoing list of like what are people's priorities for future versions of Backdrop, and that often is taking new contrib modules and adding them in. It's often expanding some of our current functionality that didn't exist in Drupal 7, like the layout system or the configuration management system. And it's going to keep getting new features. It also, we have a huge focus on user experience, and we have people who are just dedicated to like finding little nitpicky problems with the interface and filing issues and fixing them immediately. So we've already had hundreds of usability improvements that have gone into it. So if you're familiar with using Drupal 7, you use Backdrop, it's going to feel familiar, but we've also fixed hundreds of little tiny irritating interface problems. And so we're hoping it'll be everything you didn't like about Drupal 7 has been repaired or improved slightly.
Overlay module.
Yeah, but it's a living, breathing system. And we don't necessarily know where we'll be in 5 years in the future, but we have a pretty good process of asking the community for what they want and incorporating those features. We have a poll, we have a bunch of really active contributors in core, and we do know timeline-wise that Backdrop 2 will be coming out in 2025. Our original plan was to come out 2 years after the end of life of Drupal 7, so that people would have at least 2 years to get off of that platform. But with the shifting end date of Drupal 7, we've decided to sort of just stick to the 2025 date. So Drupal 7 should end in the end of 2023, and we're going to still release Backdrop 2 in 2025. And Backdrop 2 was originally going to drop the Drupal upgrade, and we're probably not going to do that now, understanding there will be more people still coming from Drupal 7 later. Right now, it's called the Drupal compatibility layer. We have just an include file where if you're running Drupal modules that are calling Drupal functions, you turn on this compatibility layer, and it gives you a detailed error logging about deprecated function calls and stuff like that. So it'll help a developer get updated from the Drupal way to the Backdrop way, with links to documentation and stuff like that.
So that's interesting. So one of the things that people were asking was, how easy is it to switch from Drupal 7 specifically into Backdrop? And it sounds like you've got quite a lot of detailed interactive things to help with that.
Yeah, we're trying. The easy answer to that question is it's a lot easier than moving from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, but it does really depend on the complexity of your site. I've had websites that I've updated entirely in a day, and that includes updating the theme, porting contrib modules that weren't already ported, and redoing custom modules. And if you have a simple enough site, you can do that. I've also had really complicated sites that have taken a couple of months, and when people upgrade, it's not always the exact same site in Drupal to the exact same site in Backdrop. I've done that a handful of times, but a lot of people are like, if I'm investing, let's do some other stuff at the same time. That's why a rebuild to something like Drupal 9 is so attractive, because it's like, if you are going to be rebuilding, why not we rethink the whole problem space? And so depending on how much of that change you want to add in your process, it does really change. Our goal is that Backdrop is at least 80% API compatible with your Drupal 7 site. In practice, people have felt it's closer to 90%, which is great. And we do have an ongoing core, I call it initiative. We don't technically have those kind of initiatives. It's a collection of issues that are specifically focused on upgrading from Drupal and snags that you might hit and trying to make that process easier. We've introduced a bunch of things like the deprecated function notices, so that if you have your error logging on, we'll tell you when something is deprecated, so it gives you a chance to update it before it's removed. We're working on creating something similar for changes in our object-oriented code, so that if we change a property, we can have information on that, if we change the way something behaves. So we're trying to not just like build in backwards compatibility, but also build in notifications of updates so that, okay, this works today. That's great. It's backwards compatible, but I also get help on how to make it work tomorrow. So we're trying to ease that process and make it as pain-free as possible to get into the next version of Backdrop, whether you're coming from Drupal 7 or even today's version of Backdrop.
Well, actually, yeah, it's one of the questions that we were asked was, we kind of make a natural connection between Drupal 7 and Backdrop, but there could be people on Drupal 8 or 9 who thinking maybe Backdrop is an option for them. So is that even possible?
It's definitely possible. I mean, the same way, if you move from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, you do a migration, you take all of your data out of the system and you put it into the new system. You can do a migration from anything to anything with enough work, right? Somebody ported the migrate module to Backdrop, so you could do a backwards migration. If you wanted to do a migration from Drupal 8 to Backdrop, you can use the migrate module to do that. It's definitely not supported in core, so it doesn't have the same level of commitment to making that an easy process as it is coming from Drupal 7. Where Drupal 7, we wanted Backdrop to be the next version of your website. You drop in the code, you run an update script, you're done. And so that's sort of we're focusing on the update in place model. It's something that people who use WordPress are more familiar with, people with old versions of Drupal used to do, as opposed to the build a new website and pull your data in, which is what you're now having to do with moving Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 or Drupal 6 to Drupal 8. So yeah, it's definitely possible. It's not going to be as easy because it's not a priority for us.
That's totally understandable. Yeah, but the idea is possible. It's kind of interesting. So you mentioned earlier on about the fact that Drupal is heading into the enterprise a little bit. So what are those projects? Can you give examples of some projects or types of projects that are best suited to Backdrop?
Yeah, I think I might not be the best person to ask that question to, because I want to do every project in Backdrop. For me, it was like in Drupal 7 land, go back 10 years or so, someone would come to us with a scope of work or a project that they wanted to build, and you would look at it and think, like, can I do this on Drupal 7? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you can very easily do that on Backdrop. It's just a more performant, more feature-rich version of Drupal 7. So there weren't a lot of websites 10 years ago that I would say, no, you can't do that on Drupal 7. Drupal 7 can't handle that. There are definitely some where you're like, maybe it's not the best fit, right? Like if somebody wanted a document management system, you're like, well, Drupal's not great with files. It's fine if a file is an asset for a different piece of content that you're managing in an interface, but it's not the best solution for that. It's the same with Backdrop. It's the same tool. I would argue the same is true for even Drupal 9 today. It's not great document management. So there's definitely strong points and weak points, but I feel like in terms of what Backdrop can do, our focus is more on who's using it than what it's capable of. So it's the same as Drupal 7 was. It's more performant because we've removed some of the edge cases. So there are requirements that your site might have that might make it not suitable for Backdrop. So if you need to run on alternate field storage, that's not supported in Backdrop Core anymore. If you need to run on a database system that's Postgres, it's not supported in Backdrop anymore. There is a fork of Backdrop called, I've forgotten it, Silkscreen.
Okay. I love the idea of Backdrop. That's brilliant.
So Silkscreen CMS is great. It is a fantastic maintainer. He comes out with, John Franklin comes out with updates every time there's a Backdrop Core update. There's a Silkscreen CMS update immediately. Silkscreen is the press flow of Backdrop. So it includes all of these sort of enterprise level features that Backdrop maybe doesn't care about because it's not our core audience. So it includes the alternate field storage, it includes the alternate database systems. So if you need that stuff, you can have it. But just because Backdrop said this does not apply to at least 80% of the people running the software, it's not going to be a core priority, doesn't mean you can't do it, right? The same way in Drupal 7, there were a lot of things that maybe people didn't know if it could do, but they made it do it. Same thing with Backdrop. We've got people who are making it work however needed.
So what are some of the most important lessons that you've learned all that time you spent participating, and still spend, to be fair, spent participating in the Drupal community that have helped shape Backdrop and how you work in there?
I think the biggest thing is how we treat people who are new to the project. So we're trying to make sure that everybody has an on-ramp regardless of your technical ability. And that means that if all you can do is push buttons in the interface, we want to make sure you have every button you need to complete that website. If you want to become a developer and you want to start in the theme, we're not going to call you a themer. We're going to call you a theme developer because we believe themers are developers. So just like try and change that language around. If you're building a site, we're not going to call you a site builder. We're going to call you an architect, just to try and give these people a little bit more like authority in our community. And then we're going to make sure that, we've got really clear guidelines posted in our forum about how you treat people who have questions. And in our issue queue, we're going to make sure anyone with any question there's no stupid question. You answer a question, you ask a question, you get an answer. Also, it's okay to be wrong, right? Like I'm wrong a lot. There's lots of people in our community who are open to the fact that we could change our minds about things, just to try and make the whole space feel more comfortable to people who are new to open source contribution. We participate in a lot of open source contribution events. The Grace Hopper celebration is coming up, which is a conference that celebrates women in computer science. They have a day called Open Source Day, where we get a whole bunch of people who come and contribute to different open source projects. Backdrop's been a part of that for 4 consecutive events now. I think 2 were the same year, so 3rd year. But yeah, so just trying to find on-ramps for people to come in. Being on GitHub, there's this good first issue label that works across all of GitHub. And so anyone who wants to contribute to any project can click a link, find an issue for Backdrop, jump in, write code. They automatically get a sandbox for testing. They can click around the website, and they're contributing with very little effort. So try and sort of lower all of the barriers to entry to getting into using the software, contributing to the software, and becoming a part of the community.
So actually, you did bring up a good point there around the good first issue and GitHub. And that's when Backdrop forked from Drupal, you needed a new place to work. It's like, right, what are we going to do? And you decided that one of the core pieces of that was GitHub. Now, Drupal itself now is moving to a similar model, actually with GitLab, but the similar, using stuff elsewhere that's well used and so on. What advice would you give to the Drupal Association as they build on standard collaboration tools?
Yeah, that's hard. I feel like a lot of the reasons we chose GitHub at the time was because we couldn't have done what we just do without it. There are a lot of things that were much better when they were custom built for Drupal. The Drupal issue queue is fantastic for what it needs to do, and it does it so well. And other issue queues, GitHub, even GitLab, they're not comparable, and it's going to take work together. One of the things that I found most beneficial for our project was leveraging things that the entire community on GitHub is using. So GitHub has automated testing tools built in. It has automated sandbox tools. It has automatic code checks. Like all of this stuff that we had to build specifically for Drupal is now something lots of projects are doing, and there are common tools that all of them can use. And so being on a platform that has lots of other projects on it, but just don't reinvent the wheel. I know that there's like Oregon State University is working on testing environments with GitLab, free open source testing environments with GitLab. So that would be something that I would recommend the Drupal community to look into. I know they're working on testing environments on GitLab too. That could be an opportunity for collaboration. But for us, just that when you work on something that the entire platform is working on, it moves so fast, and you're able to take the benefits of everything everyone else is working on and say, oh, what are people doing today? Oh, look, this cool thing. We can adapt that to, oh, they've already done it for us. Actually, we can just add it on. It is really great being a project part of a larger ecosystem where you can leverage a bunch of other stuff that benefits you too.
Yeah. Does the DA offer any kind of support to Backdrop? I mean, like space on Drupal.org or anything like that?
No. We get a lot of support from individual members of the Drupal Association. There are a lot of really friendly people who have been supportive of the Backdrop project and for various people in the Backdrop community for a while. But the Drupal Association has a mission to support the Drupal project. And Backdrop being not the Drupal project goes specifically against that goal. And so we haven't gotten any support from the Drupal Association. And I think there's a good reason for that. That's not their mission, right? But yeah, no, we haven't officially made any kind of, collaboration there. But there are a lot of people in the Backdrop community right now looking at the majority of Drupal sites out there, still running on Drupal 7, still doing their regular updates, going, how can we help these people, right? And I think we have a common goal there where the Backdrop community wants to help the people who are still on Drupal 7 and the Drupal community wants to help the people who are still on Drupal 7. And maybe helping that section of the Drupal community might fall under the mission of helping the Drupal project. I don't know. So we're open to trying to figure out what that collaboration might look like and if there is any way we can work together.
It does make sense, yeah. So this could be the last question, actually, because we've only got 4 minutes left. But when you go ahead and you embark on forking a project as large and complicated as Drupal into Backdrop, it's a huge commitment that you're taking on. As you've seen, the interest that you got so quickly, even before you were ready, was huge, and it's only grown since. How can I put this? Do you have an exit strategy? How are you going to deal with this? And how do you define and ensure that there's a long-term sustainability, long-term health of the Backdrop project? I was trying to kind of get onto that subject earlier today, you may have noticed, but didn't quite get there.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it's something that, Nate had been thinking about since the very beginning as already being a maintainer of Webform, which is one of the top 10 modules on Drupal and an active core contributor. He knows what it's like to take on the responsibilities of maintaining a project. Multiply that by, now it's core, right? And so at the very, very beginning, when we started to set up project leadership structures, we specifically adopted something that did not involve a BDFL or benevolent dictator for life. We didn't want the for life part, right? So we set up a more democratic process. We adopted a Apache project management committee model where people can nominate or step down from the management structure at any time. Nate was on there for a few years and then pieced out. He's like, I want to work on code. I don't want to be involved in decision making. So I'm just going to leave that to other people. We've had a lot of turnover in that committee. We've tried to duplicate or increase the number of committers that we have to core. So we're always trying to invite new people and make sure we've got redundancy where we need it. For me, whether Backdrop is successful or not, that metric is like, if Nate and I leave the project, will it continue without us? And in May, which is the last time we did a new feature release for Backdrop, Nate and I were like, we're not going to be involved. We're going on vacation. We're going to be in Hawaii. You guys, you could do this, right? And we brought our computers in case there was an emergency. But the entire core development team was able to come out by following the documentation and the checklists and everything that we'd set up as part of our process to make sure we get it right every time. They were just able to do the same thing and create a new release completely on their own. So I think we're trying to make sure that all of the structure is in place around the community, that it doesn't matter who's leading it. You can have new people, you can have new core committers, you can have whatever, and everything will still sort of run the same way. It's obviously nice to have continuity. You don't want to swap everyone out at once, but we do have the ability that any one of those people can have an exit plan. They can all be like, you know what, I'm having a new baby and I'm not going to be around for 5 years, and I'll check in later and we'll see what our priorities are going to be. And that's totally fine. We ran into a lot of that at the beginning of COVID. We had a lot of sort of turnover in our leadership because priorities changed for a lot of people. And it was a great way for us to sort of test our leadership model and our process and our documentation and make sure that the project could continue with no issues.
Well, thank you so much. I so wish that we had started these Q&As years earlier. I feel like I've missed out on so much having not done this before. So thank you very much. I see it's not Matthew. I see we're being joined. So I shall hand back to the stage and say thank you. And until next time.
Yes, thank you too.